I'm Linda Dixon from the Lexington Veterans Association. Welcome to all of you. We're delighted to have you for another wonderful program. Okay, my few announcements. Thank you to Starbucks of Lexington for the coffee. We're very sorry for the snafu, but it's here. They're wonderful. They supply us with free coffee for every one of our programs. Thank you to all who brought baked goods that will clog our arteries but taste delicious as they do it, so be sure and avail yourself of the very tasty goodies. And thank you to all who made a donation in our little basket, because that is our operating money. We have no other source of income. Last month I told you that as part of the Veterans Day celebration, 15 Lexington High School juniors wrote essays on a veteran in their lives who had influenced them. And they were really wonderful, and some of them were read and presented at the Veterans Day ceremony. And several of you suggested that you'd like to read them, so they are now posted on the website. And if you go to our main site, which is www.lexmavets.org, here's our first page. Right up there, Lexington High School student essays for Veterans Day. All 15 of them are there. But I think if you just want to read any or all of them, they're really quite impressive. They're really quite inspiring. Also, our schedule for 2018 for spring, January through June, is complete. We're just tweaking the finished product. So within the next few days, probably, we will send you an email with the full schedule, so you can mark your calendars and you can have an idea what our programs will be for the next 6 months. As a quick preview, in January, most people love naval battles. We have a naval battle. The loss of the USS Quincy. The Quincy was built right here in the Quincy shipyard in Massachusetts. It was the first casualty of the Guadalcanal campaign. It was really quite a disaster. It was a pretty awful situation. And we will learn all about that from Bob Began, who has given this presentation in the past and has done just a wonderful job of it. That will be Monday, January 11. January 8. Whatever the second Monday is in January, I think it's the 8th. And we will hope to see you then. The blue box on the table awaits your contributions of magazines, note cards, notepads, or any other things you get in the mail free. Pat Costello, will gladly take them over to the VA hospital, and they thank you ever so much. I see bags of magazines. Thank you so much. They're much appreciated. Does anybody have an announcement that they would like to share with the group?
I do.
Yes, ma'am. Pat.
Please do not bring in any magazines that are over 4 weeks old. If they're like Time magazine, that's no longer news, that's history. So if it's other magazines like Yankee or so on that have more of a longevity, that's fine. But news magazines over 4 weeks old are history. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. Any other announcements? Okay. I think the coffee's ready, so why don't we just declare a break? And anyone who would like to enjoy a cup of coffee during the presentation, help yourselves. And we'll start in about 5 or 10 minutes. Thank you so much.
Tolerance for the stuff. No coffee? Okay. Oh, I had tea, so now I need a coffee. Yeah.
Personally, at all that DNA thing, is that an old for DNA?
Yesterday, the day before, I was with Linda. She's still deep.
Those people that spend all their free time on
Quick results.
detective on some of the Alex, puzzle for 20 years, solve them. So for the no, I know I'm answering the deals right now.
No, I still I saw
We had a whole problem with
I still don't. They already took the date. We're kind of
I had an aunt not only making sandwich and anyway, so she had it done, but you know, Apple was more family, and like now the ancestry is different. So I wonder if there's value in DNA testing. But if they're different,
they weren't necessarily switching a salt. I haven't touched
I see where you park. Very
I know.
just down 120. I don't know. Not a veteran. Oh, yeah, the library has a lot. The regular veterans.
Excuse me? Try not to spill coffee down your back here.
Yes, people always forward there.
Notice you do pretty quickly.
Yeah.
You were very convincing, Bill. Oh, yeah.
Yes. All right.
You did. That was good.
I had a few good ones, like some repetitive, like
Speaking of, the last larger event of the year is November.
Can I help you? Get your
All right, thank you very much.
See you.
So I think we'll begin the official part of our program. Charlie Bevilacqua, you're not here, are you?
Yes, I am.
Oh, I was trying to find you. Okay. We will begin with the Pledge of Allegiance. Will all please rise? And Charlie Bevilacqua will lead us, and you may have you always have some remarks to make, Charlie.
I'd like to remind any honorably discharged veterans, you are now authorized and requested to render a hand salute during the Pledge of Allegiance. And that's whether you got a hat on or not, unless you got a New York Yankees hat on. But anyway, if you're at a cemetery and you go to a funeral at a cemetery and there's military presence there, salute by holding your hand over your heart or rendering a proper hand salute, honorably discharged veterans. Whether you're, as I say, covered or not, and inside or outside. So right here, we'd like to see everybody doing a hand salute. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Ready. 2. It is duly noted that no one took a knee.
Thank you, Charlie. Now let's get down to business. I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Bob Allison, who's no stranger. He's spoken to us, I think, at least a couple of times in the past. Now, Dr. Bob is an expert on colonial and revolutionary American history. The last time he gave a talk, which was the first time I had heard him, I was surprised and delighted to find what a great sense of humor he had. Because I don't know, historians, the stereotype of a historian is not necessarily someone who really gives a witty presentation. But I guess when you teach a room full of college students and you try to interest them away from texting and emailing on their phones, some humor really comes in handy. So be prepared for a really entertaining talk. Dr. Allison is currently co-editing a book about the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. That's what he's going to talk about today. Now, fighting a revolution was difficult. Getting agreement among the 13 colonies to become a nation and to form a government was difficult. And ratifying the Constitution agreeing on the law of the land and how the citizens would be governed proved just as difficult. The ratification process was a year of, in Bob's words, tension, violence, intrigue, suspense, bribery, and deal-making. And he's going to tell us how it all miraculously came about. Now, interestingly, as a side note, the year 2026 will mark the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, the Declaration of Independence, and so on. Now, of course, 2025 is a big year here in Lexington. Well, it turns out that there is a group headed by Dr. Bob called Revolution 250. And it's a statewide coalition of historical and civic organizations. They're already working on this incredible 250th commemoration. So if anyone has more interest in the subject, by all means, please talk to them. It's going to be an incredible undertaking, and 2026 will be here before we know it. All right, I wanted to get that plug in. Bob has been a member of the history faculty at Suffolk University for more than 20 years, including 10 years as chair. And I know we're going to enjoy what he has to say to us. Please welcome Bob Allison.
Okay. Great, thank you. Well, thank you, Linda. Thank you all for... It's a little alarming. Is that too loud? Okay. I think it's fine. Wonder how far we're projecting. It's a little alarming when the person introducing you tells the audience how witty you are. Boy, this is going to be a riot and all. I'd rather it come as a surprise if it comes at all. And I think that if we were going to be placing odds in September of 1787 on the likelihood of the Constitution being ratified, I probably would have voted against it. It seemed like an uphill struggle. It did not seem at all like a sure thing. And it wasn't. It's something very much in doubt. And this is a year of the first political public debate in American history. You know, the decision to declare independence was made in private, in Congress, and also in town meetings. And it's not something that was engaged from one end of the continent to the other. But the decision to ratify the Constitution, even though the Constitution itself had been written in a secret enclave in Philadelphia, the decision to ratify was a very public one. And it was a very public debate that engaged people from one end of the country to the other. James Madison, who probably had more right to voice an opinion on this than anyone else, said that if you want to understand what the Constitution meant, you shouldn't look at the Philadelphia Convention. What you should look at are the state ratifying debates and the debates in the press where people argued about each clause, arguing about what it meant, what it portended, and why they should or should not adopt this. So this is a national argument. And it does, in a sense, if the Constitution had not been ratified in 1787-88, the debate itself created national political communities, national political alliances, and also a national forum where people could express their opinions. Now, supporters of the Constitution, there are many, and I'm sure you know some of them, George Washington perhaps being the foremost, James Madison, others, and then there are other supporters. Madison, Alexander Hamilton, Gouverneur Morris had already been agitating since the early 1780s for a stronger national government. I'm not going to get into why they felt a stronger national government was necessary. That's probably a subject for another day. They saw the failures of the Articles of Confederation. The country was deeply in debt. had no way of paying off the debt. In fact, in 1785, the United States had defaulted on its loan from the French government. And if you've ever defaulted on a loan, I don't know if anyone here has, don't want to raise your hands because there may be creditors out there, it's going to be very difficult for to borrow money from anyone else. And the United States had this deep problem of a debt incurred in fighting the war for independence. And these guys, Hamilton, Washington, Madison, saw the necessity to create a stronger government that could raise a revenue source. And then, of course, there are merchants, urban tradesmen, who see the trade had pretty much died up in the late 1780s. The United States was in something of a recession. And the problem wasn't, gee, we don't have a government that can create a stimulus package, but we don't have a government that can protect trade. That is international commerce. In 1785, Algiers had declared war on the United States, and this essentially closes the Mediterranean to American trade at the same time as the British and the French had said, well, you no longer can bring your goods to Jamaica, Barbados, Saint-Domingue. So the Caribbean and the Mediterranean both closed to American trade, and the United States does not have any force to use in protecting American commerce. These are all bad things. And plus another group very much in favor of a stronger government were the people who had loaned money to the United States or to the state governments, and they wanted to ensure that they would be paid back. Then they were called, I think, speculators and holders of paper notes. Now, in opposition to a stronger national government, just what I've described, some of you may be wondering, gee, it sounds like we have big problems. Who would oppose a solution to these problems? Is anyone here saying, I would oppose a solution to these problems because I stand to benefit from the system as it is? Among the most prominent were people like Patrick Henry. He was a governor of Virginia, and Virginia was doing okay in this period. Why would Virginia, or if Virginia becomes part of a national government, the Virginia legislature will be a lot less important. Also, the governor of New York, George Clinton, not the Grand Master of Funk, but the governor of New York, was an opponent of a system that would render New York less important. And Samuel Adams in Massachusetts. Adams, like Clinton and Henry, had spent much of his life opposing a centralized government far away. And they feared, I think painted Henry and Clinton as being rather self-interested, but also there's a philosophical reason. They did not want a government that would be beyond the reach of ordinary citizens. If you create a distant government, it will become tyrannical. They had spent most of their lives fighting against a distant, tyrannical government. They didn't want to create something similar. And Samuel Adams wrote in a letter to Richard Henry Lee, a congressman from Virginia, he said, I confess, as I enter the building, I stumble at the threshold. That is with the preamble. I meet with a consolidated government instead of a union of states. The phrase, we the people, perhaps the most eloquent phrase in the whole Constitution and one we treasure, was one that Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, George Clinton feared. Who were the people of the United States? Was there such an entity in Massachusetts? And so you have this philosophical reason for opposing a consolidated government which they feared the Constitution would create. Just to back up for a minute here, the Adams, Henry, Clinton knew that within their states, people in towns like Lexington had a great deal of power in the state government. Massachusetts had about 400 members of the Assembly. In the federal Congress, there were going to be about 100 members, making laws for 3 million people. Would that group of 100 understand what was happening in the entire country? Also, the Lexington town meeting chose its representative to the general court. You knew who was representing you. They served a 1-year term. Will you know the one person representing 40,000 people in a congressional district or 30,000 people in a congressional district? Also, the Constitution gives to Congress the power to determine the time and places for elections. So Congress could say, Massachusetts' representatives will be elected on the third Sunday in March in Worcester. And you could go out to Worcester to vote for your representative. You know, if you read the Constitution carefully, you can see these powers given to Congress, which would allow Congress to become tyrannical, out of touch, other things which, of course, we, with our 230 some odd years of experience, know would be utterly impossible. For example, the Constitution requires Congress from time to publish its journals. Well, what does from time to time mean? Congress will have control over the 10-mile square district that will become the national capital. And that, according to the opponents of the Constitution, will become a refuge for all of the criminals in the country who will flock to this capital city to be under the protection of Congress. So in opposition, there are people who see a national government as taking power from the states. And Madison, of course, wanted to create a system that would take power from the states. But there is a reason you would want to have states to have some role in this, because you know who your state representative is. You have more control over your state government than you will have over this national government. I fear the more I talk about this, the more alarming I find the whole enterprise. So in opposition also, if you had served in the Continental Army during the War for Independence, you very likely are going to support a stronger national government. You will support ratification. If, on the other hand, you had served in a state militia, you're more likely to oppose it. And so soldiers in the state militia and officers in the state militia, farmers, debtors, Westerners, people on the frontier, tended to have serious misgivings about this. Also among the opponents were Baptists and Presbyterians, as opposed to Congregationalists and Anglicans who tended to support it. I hear some chuckling. Are there Baptists and Presbyterians here? And the reason they opposed it was this Constitution does not give any protection to religious minorities and religious liberty. Remember, each state had most states had a Declaration of Rights or a Bill of Rights, a protection, and in Virginia, we'll get back to this in a bit. The federal Constitution, the most important thing to remember, I suppose, about the ratification debate is the Constitution, as presented in 1787, did not have a Bill of Rights. And when we get into the argument about ratification, we'll see that that is the essential reason people would oppose this, because constitutions typically began with a Bill of Rights. So on the one hand, no Bill of Rights, which means no protection for Baptists, Presbyterians, other religious minorities. On the other hand, there's a clause in the Constitution which forbids any religious test for anyone to hold office under the United States. And under this reasoning, one Massachusetts opponent wrote, anyone, including a papist or a Mohammedan, could become president of the United States. And would you want that? He clearly did not. So you have both, we don't like it because it doesn't protect religious minorities. Also, we don't like it because it would allow papists and Mohammedans to serve in office. So among the reason people would oppose this, one, no Bill of Rights. Secondly, specific powers given to Congress or given to the national government, which I've just mentioned a couple of them. You know, Congress being the judge of elections for Congress and no religious test. Article 1, Section 8, which lists the powers of Congress, we could go through line by line and you could see the alarming nature of this. Now, James Madison, who is, of course, the real architect of the Constitution, had the most important requirement for any political figure in that Madison knew how to count. And as the convention rose in September, he anticipated what the ratification debate would look like. It needs 9 states to support it in order to take effect. And Madison went geographically down the list. New Hampshire is very likely going to ratify it. Massachusetts is in doubt. In Boston, people seemed to be in favor of it. People out here in the countryside were less certain. And remember, the beginning of the year, 1787, there had been an armed rebellion in Massachusetts against the state government over the issue of taxes and debt. Rhode Island, very much against it. Madison knows Rhode Island is probably going to reject it. Connecticut, it's probably going to pass. New York, in doubt. Madison is actually writing from New York, where he's serving in Congress. Governor Clinton, he knew to be against the ratification of the Constitution, but at the point Madison wrote, there hadn't been much agitation over the issue. New Jersey, of course, was in favor of it. Delaware, also in favor of it. Pennsylvania was divided. The West was against it. The supporters of this very democratic state constitution opposed it. And we'll get back to Pennsylvania in a bit. Maryland was in favor. Virginia was divided. Madison is writing this in a letter to Thomas Jefferson, and Jefferson would have noted that Virginia, the largest state, which at the beginning of the convention, it had the largest delegation, at the end only had 3 delegates there to sign it. One being Madison, one to be a fellow named Blair, and the other to be the president of the convention, George Washington. And Washington, if you've looked at the manuscript Constitution, had signed it both as president of the convention and deputy from Virginia to fill in the number of Virginians actually signing this thing. And Governor Henry, Madison knew, was very much against it, as was one of the other Virginians who had spent the summer at the convention, George Mason. Mason, Madison said, left the convention in a very ill humor indeed. In fact, Mason had said he would sooner cut off his right hand than use it to sign the Constitution. So he's going to be opposed. North Carolina was divided. South Carolina and Georgia, both very much in favor. So there are 7 states likely to ratify it. And those that are in doubt are very much in doubt. And one thing you'll notice if you were paying attention to the list, the small states now are supporting this. You'll recall if you, well, I guess maybe you won't if you hadn't thought about the convention itself. The small states were really opposed to the system being created because they thought not having an equal vote in both houses of the national legislature would be a bad thing. Now, the small states very much in favor. The larger states, Massachusetts, which was in fact one of the 4 or 5 largest states, Pennsylvania, Virginia, North Carolina, New York, were very much opposed or divided on the whole issue. Okay, so what happens to make this thing work? One is, the supporters of it do something brilliant, which is something anyone involved in politics today could learn from. They take the right name for what they are doing. They call themselves Federalists. They really had wanted a national system. A federal system rests on sovereign states. This is why Samuel Adams blanched at "we the people" instead of "we the states." A system should rest on states as opposed to a mass of 3 million citizens who wouldn't know each other. They know what they're creating is a national system with some federal elements, but they call themselves Federalists. And if you're opposed to their system, and you are indeed a Federalist, you can't really call yourself a Federalist. So choosing the right name is always a critical thing. A fellow named Pelatiah Webster writes the first pro-Constitution pamphlet, and Noah Webster writes a pamphlet calling this a federal constitution, and they really take the name, leaving those who are against it to scramble. They don't really call themselves anti-federalists. They call themselves, well, we're opposed to the Constitution. A lot of them think we do need a different system. They don't like this particular one being proposed. They would like to have a second convention. Okay, now James Wilson of Philadelphia. Wilson's a Philadelphia lawyer, and he gives the first great speech in defense or arguing for ratification of the Constitution. A public meeting in Philadelphia outside the State House on the 6th of October, and Wilson explains a lot of things about the Constitution. Wilson, by the way, as I said, is a Philadelphia lawyer, And he makes the kind of argument you might expect from a Philadelphia lawyer, particularly one who thinks that most of the people listening to him are really low-grade morons and can't understand his arguments. Great lawyer, probably not a very good politician in that sense. And he explains why there is no Bill of Rights. It would be a mistake to have a Bill of Rights, because this is a system that creates a government with limited powers. Every power not given is reserved. Article 1, Section 8 spells out what are the powers of Congress. Any power Congress does not have there, Congress doesn't have. And he says it would be much more dangerous to try to list the rights people have, because then that would imply a government that could trample on the rights that aren't listed. For instance, he says, the liberty of the press, which has been a copious source of public declamation and opposition, he asks, what power is there in this Constitution for the federal government to interfere with liberty of the press? Can anyone point to a clause that threatens liberty of the press? See, I didn't think so. So, if you say Congress can't trample on liberty of the press, then that implies that Congress could, and it could do other things. So much more dangerous to try to list rights than to list the specific powers. By the way, who here is convinced by Mr. Wilson's argument? See, it's not a winning political argument that Wilson makes, but it is the argument the supporters of the Constitution will cling to until about halfway through this debate. Any power not given is reserved. And Wilson becomes really a lightning rod for opponents of the Constitution. He's actually, if you do oppose this, he is your perfect foil. Smug, wealthy Philadelphia lawyer, knows more than you do. I'm really starting to hate him myself. And in fact, he becomes a target. He's burned in effigy throughout the country. And in fact, the opponents of it make a certain number of arguments repeatedly. And someone publishes a recipe for an anti-federalist essay. It says, well-born, 9 times. Aristocracy, 18 times. Liberty of the press, 13 times. Liberty of conscience, once. Negro slavery, once. Trial by jury, 7 times. Great men, 6 times repeated. Mr. Wilson, 40 times. And lastly, it says, George Mason's right hand in a cutting box. Put them all together and dish them up at pleasure. And it says these words will bear roasting, boiling, or frying. What's remarkable about them, they will bear being served after once used a dozen times to the same palate and table. So you have the anti-federal arguments, or the opponent's arguments, which are relatively easy to ridicule because there is a certain sameness to them. Warnings about aristocracy, great men, titles, liberty of the press, and creating an aristocracy, these warnings about what could happen. And, you know, we all, well, maybe not all of us get tired of hearing the same things repeated time and time again. Now, on the other hand, there are some opponents of this, there are many opponents of this, whose arguments cannot be dismissed so lightly. And one, of course, is Thomas Jefferson. Madison sends him Wilson's speech. Madison also sends him a copy of the Constitution. And Jefferson says he really likes a lot of what he sees in this document. But then he says there are other things which completely stagger any disposition he has to support it. And also Wilson's argument, he says, is simply too legalistic. Jefferson says that Wilson's argument might have suited the audience for which it was intended, an audience of smug Philadelphians, but it won't do for Americans. And also he says, you know, Wilson's argument about a Bill of Rights, an argument which Madison shared, Jefferson says is never going to work. And Jefferson says, whatever you think about a Bill of Rights, and Madison says if there is a Bill of Rights, Madison said, was a parchment barrier. And a government that wanted to override a parchment barrier would do so. Jefferson says a Bill of Rights is what the people are entitled to against every government on earth. And he also points out that if a right is protected in a parchment barrier and the right is then infringed upon, then people do have a recourse in the courts to protect their rights. Interesting argument. Anyway, Jefferson says he likes some of the things he sees in the Constitution, that the government doesn't rest on state legislatures. He, like Madison, sees the state legislatures as being dangerous entities. He also likes the division of powers between the executive, the legislative, and judicial branches. He also likes that the power the legislature has to levy taxes. And for this reason alone, he says, he supports the idea of people voting for their representatives. He was a little wary of democratic government, as we would say. He likes the compromise between large and small states. He likes the fact that the representatives vote by representative as opposed to by state. And he also likes the fact that the executive can veto legislation. But what he doesn't like, no Bill of Rights. And that, as I said, is the thing that a lot of people don't like about it. And also, he doesn't like the fact that the president can be eligible for re-election. The president, Jefferson said, will be a bad edition of a Polish king. Will be constantly re-elected. And each choice of a new president will excite interest in France and England, each one eager to have an Anglo man or a Gallo man in office. The House of Representatives, Jefferson feared, would not be strong enough to oppose a president. That is, it's made up of a lot of non-entities elected from around the country. And how will they be able to stand up to a president who's really trying to seize power? I confess, Jefferson wrote to Adams, that John Adams, who's the American minister in London at the time, Jefferson is in Paris, that there are things in it which stagger all my disposition to subscribe to what such an assembly has proposed. Jefferson had referred to the men who gathered in Philadelphia as an assembly of demigods. And then he's checking that as he is reading the document. Now Adams, who of course was the author of the Massachusetts Constitution, also finds much not to like in the Constitution, but there's somewhat different things than Jefferson found not to like. Adams feared that the Senate, as constructed, would form an aristocracy and would collude with the president in becoming an aristocracy. You are afraid of the one, he wrote to Jefferson, I of the few. We both agree that the many should have a full, fair, and perfect representation. Adams would increase the president's power, take more power away from the Senate. And as for Jefferson's fear that a president would constantly be re-elected, Adams thought that would actually be a good thing. That is, if constant turnover in office and each new election was a dangerous thing, well, then have fewer of them. As often as there's an election, there would be the kind of turmoil and corruption that Jefferson feared. So, Jefferson and Adams, with their reasons for opposing the Constitution, would give Madison and other supporters certain pause in thinking that this is a perfect system, which none of them said it was, but one that would lead to, well, the better future. Now, in order for the Constitution to be ratified, the states needed to call conventions. They're actually bypassing two different bodies that would have opposed ratification, one being Congress itself. Congress doesn't have any role in determining what will happen with the Constitution. It is going to go directly to the states, where state conventions would meet. A convention which represents the sovereign will of the people of a state, not the legislature, which is elected by the people of the state for particular purposes, ordinary pieces of legislation. Conventions which do represent the people of Massachusetts or the people of Georgia and have that moment where they express their sovereign power. Now, the first major convention is in Pennsylvania. In order for the convention to be called, the legislature has to call the convention. The opponents of the Constitution in Pennsylvania want to prevent the state from calling a convention fast because they want more time to get their message out, to deliberate about this. They wonder, what's the hurry in pushing this thing through? Knowing that they would not have the votes in the legislature to stop the state from calling a convention, the opponents of ratification simply stay away from the State House so the legislature won't have a quorum. They're going to prevent a quorum from forming in the Pennsylvania legislature, thus the legislature could not call for a convention. And what the supporters of the Constitution do is send out the sergeant at arms with the militia to round up these guys, bring them into the State House so that then the majority can vote. Now, of course, the opponents of the Constitution are saying what the supporters want to do is replace a democratic elected government with a military despotism. And here they have the supporters of the new government calling out military force to bring them in. It's not, I guess it would be called bad optics today for someone to strong-arm the opponents like this, which they do. Anyway, they do call for a convention, and it meets in Philadelphia in November, and every day the debates of this convention are published in the Philadelphia newspapers. And in this, oh, thank you, Ed. I wanted 2 olives, Ed. The opponents in Philadelphia were very articulate, well organized, they had good arguments, and they were outvoted. There are 46 members of the convention who are going to support ratification. There were 23 who had questions about the Constitution. And the leader of the convention is our friend James Wilson, who had been a member of the Philadelphia Convention, which had drawn up the Constitution. And Wilson, as he had done earlier, has a long speech explaining what the Constitution means. Now, this is in November, and why there shouldn't be a Bill of Rights. The opponents in Philadelphia argue about each clause. And when Wilson, for example, says you can't list all of the possible rights people might have, to list one would put the other ones in jeopardy, of course, the opponents, Robert Whitehill, a member of the convention from Western Pennsylvania, says, well, how come then in Article 1, Section 9, it says Congress, the privilege of habeas corpus shall not be suspended. Here's a fundamental right, which the Constitution protects explicitly. If this government doesn't have power to trample on fundamental rights, how can you have habeas corpus protected if Wilson's argument is true, that anything not given is reserved? You've given to Congress, you've taken away from Congress this power. Does it mean every other power Congress might have, it has, or every other right is in jeopardy? How come you protect habeas corpus, but none of the other rights? And the problem, of course, for Whitehill is that Wilson's side has enough votes, whatever the objectors say. John Smiley, another member from Western Pennsylvania, says, yeah, Article 1, Section 8 does very clearly list the powers Congress has, but then it ends with all powers necessary and proper to bring the foregoing powers into operation. Well, what does that mean? Do they have all necessary and proper powers? Who will be the judge of what are necessary and proper powers? Wilson will say, well, no, necessary and proper does not an additional grant of power. It's specifically tied to the previous powers. This, of course, for those of you who are aware of what's going to happen in the next decade, when the Secretary of the Treasury says that Congress has the power to charter a bank because it's a necessary and proper thing to bring into operation the foregoing powers, one of the prime supporters of ratification, James Madison, will say, well, no, that's not what necessary and proper means. Madison was sincere in 1787, thinking that necessary and proper was a limited thing. Others had different definitions of necessary and proper. Anyway, the opponents of ratification in Pennsylvania do draw up 15 amendments that they want to see added to this document before they could support it. And there are amendments, some of which would look familiar to us, being very similar to the amendments adopted in 1789 by the first Congress, and others may seem different, but they don't have the votes. And in Pennsylvania, the convention votes 46 to 23 to adopt the Constitution, and Pennsylvania is the first major state to do so. Delaware. Is anyone from Delaware, by the way? I don't know if I've ever actually met anyone from Delaware. Maybe they never leave the borders of the state. But Delaware had adopted it unanimously on the 7th of December. On the 15th of December, Pennsylvania adopted it, and almost immediately there was rioting in Pennsylvania over the adoption of the Constitution. Those who opposed it, and opposed it for good reason, thought that they had been strong-armed into this. This had been forced on them, and they respond by rioting and burning Wilson in effigy. This actually might be a good anniversary thing for us to think about doing. Let's burn James Wilson in effigy just for old time's sake. And the minority in Pennsylvania draw up their reasons for opposing the Constitution, acknowledging a need to change the system, but thinking that this plan goes too far and it doesn't protect the rights people should have. And their opposition is something that circulates throughout the other states. Then later in December, New Jersey also ratifies unanimously. Georgia ratifies unanimously on the 31st of December. So what we have by the end of the year is 4 states have ratified it, 3 of them unanimously. The one state where there was opposition was Pennsylvania, and there it triggers rioting, burning of effigies, and other things. Now, for both sides, this isn't a happy result. The Federalists come off looking like strong-arm bullies. The Anti-Federalists look like lawless rioters. And the next big state to meet is Massachusetts. The Massachusetts Convention is going to assemble in January of 1788, and Massachusetts is critical to this whole process. There are 355 delegates to the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention, which actually meets in the Long Lane Meeting House in Boston, the church of Jeremy Belknap, who goes on to found the Massachusetts Historical Society. It turns out this is the biggest building in Boston to accommodate a group of this size. About 18 to 20 of them, in the January of 1787, had been part of Daniel Shays's army out in western Massachusetts, trying to overthrow the government of Massachusetts. There are representatives from places that hadn't bothered to send anyone to the general court for a few years. But there are towns in Maine and towns in western Massachusetts represented at this convention. And if we were going to speculate on how this is going to go, it looks like Massachusetts is going to reject the Constitution. Here's another thing. One of the most influential figures at the convention is Samuel Adams, the representative of the Boston working men, and as I've already indicated, someone who has very serious doubts about this system. Another influential figure who is not a delegate is Elbridge Gerry. And Gerry had been a member of the Philadelphia Convention, but he had opposed it at the very end. He refuses to sign it. And Gerry had said on the closing day of the convention that there was a civil war brewing in Massachusetts between the supporters of democracy, and Gerry said, democracy is the worst of all political evils, and their opponents who are just as bad. And he thought that this Constitution, instead of ameliorating this problem, this division, was going to exacerbate it. So he saw real trouble ahead for this. And Gerry is called upon by the convention as their expert witness as to what the Constitution means. Remember, he opposed it at the beginning, but he is the one saying what it means when they have a question. Now, Salem, Boston, see, the merchants are in favor of this. The rest of the Commonwealth, less so. John Hancock is elected to be the presiding officer of the convention, but Governor Hancock, whenever he has a difficult problem before him, which is whatever decision he makes in this particular case is going to alienate a large proportion of his constituents, his gout flares up. And that prevents him from attending the meeting. So he stays at his mansion on Beacon Hill while the convention is going on down the hill and on Long Lane, nursing his gout. And while this is happening, The supporters of the Constitution recognize that this is a problem. They also recognize they can't simply strong-arm their way through here in Massachusetts. So they do a couple of things that are really extraordinarily smart. One is the Federalists support and control the post office in Boston. And somehow the opposition of the Pennsylvania delegates never appears in Boston. It never makes it out of the Boston post office. Now, another thing they do, the Bostonians, who really support ratification, they recognize that a lot of these delegates from small towns in Maine, western Massachusetts, are somewhat fearful of the big, evil city. Well, they make sure these guys know that Boston's really a friendly place. They take them to dinner. They do other nice things to their country cousins. So much so that midway through the convention, their country cousins say, these guys are trying to bribe us. Well, the supporters don't want any allegation of bribery over this, so they actually have the convention as a committee convened to examine charges of bribery, and of course, no one is being bribed. I mean, showing someone from Lexington a good time in Boston isn't the same as bribing them to change their vote on something of this importance, of course, and none of you would be susceptible to such a shallow influence gaining attempt. Another thing they do that's really smart, they have a public meeting of the Boston tradesmen and artisans at the Green Dragon Tavern. These are guys, commerce has been suffering because there isn't a government strong enough to protect international trade. So they have a public meeting of the Boston tradesmen in support of ratification, and they invite Samuel Adams to it. Samuel Adams is a Democrat with a small d, meaning if his constituents think differently than he does, he thinks, well, maybe they maybe they have a point. And here he sees his constituents seem to be okay with this system about which Adams has such grave doubts. So it doesn't bring him over, but it makes him a little less hardline about supporting ratification. And then, of course, the masterstroke is this. Now, there are two different theories about what actually happens at a meeting at Governor Hancock's house. The supporters of the Constitution recognize that they are in trouble in Massachusetts. But they also know that the Constitution is in deep trouble in Virginia. And they call on Governor Hancock. And they tell him, looks like Virginia is not going to ratify. Imagine if 9 states do ratify it, and one of them is not Virginia. The country needs a president, but if Virginia is not part of the Union, George Washington cannot become president. We're going to need a president who is known, loved, and respected throughout the country. If not George Washington, Governor Hancock, who do you think the country could call upon? And they also say, we also want, we don't want amendments. We don't want to have a second convention, which is now what the opponents are calling for. Patrick Henry now says he would go to another convention to make sure the same thing didn't happen at the next one. George Clinton is also saying another convention is really what we need. Now that we've aired out both the problems in the old one and the problems in the new one, we won't have these smart guys like Hamilton, Madison trying to pull a fast one on us. So they want another convention. And they also think we should propose amendments now that will be part of it. They tell Hancock, look, there are some amendments we could live with. How about we do this? We'll draw up the amendments, Governor, and then you can present them to the convention as if they're your own, and you will say Massachusetts will support ratification, and once the Constitution takes effect, we will use our prestige among the other states. And in 1788, Massachusetts actually did have prestige among the other states, not the way we fantasize about it today. You know, today we keep sending forth our officials to the rest of the country, hoping that they will make them president, and one by one, our governors and senators are returned to us with thanks of the rest of the republic. But they tell Hancock, Hancock will say, we will use our prestige among the states to ensure that these amendments are added once this thing takes effect. So on the last day of the convention, Governor Hancock is carried in on a sedan chair, wrapped in gauze, because he's suffering from the gout. This is why he hasn't been able to be there to preside. And he does say that it's really essential to us to create a different system. And though I know some of us have doubts about this one, the future happiness of our country requires that we adopt this change. And here are amendments that we will propose to be added once the new government takes effect. There are 9 amendments, and they're somewhat more limited than the ones the Pennsylvania opposition had crafted, but they are enough in Massachusetts. And in Massachusetts, then, after Hancock presents the amendments to be added after the fact, and Samuel Adams also comes out in support of ratifying it, but making sure we add amendments later, the vote is 187 in favor, 168 against. So by a 19-vote margin, Massachusetts ratifies the Constitution. And this is a big thing. Had Massachusetts rejected it, that probably would have been the end of the process. And what happens next is that, actually, Connecticut ratifies actually by an overwhelming vote at about the same time. In Rhode Island, they call town meetings. And the town meetings in Rhode Island, is anyone here from Rhode Island? In Rhode Island, there are 237 votes in favor of ratifying the Constitution, 2,708 against. Rhode Island doesn't want any part of this. Maryland and South Carolina both ratify in the spring of 1788, each one proposing amendments to be added later. So this leaves us in the early summer of 1788 with 8 states having ratified the Constitution. And another thing that happened while Massachusetts was meeting, New Hampshire's convention assembled, I believe in Exeter or Portsmouth, one of those places. And this was one, Madison thought New Hampshire would be easy. The supporters of the Constitution look around the room. They don't recognize a lot of these people. As in Massachusetts, towns were turning out that hadn't been part of the process. And the supporters of the Constitution, fearing that New Hampshire might reject the Constitution in this convention that was supposed to be an easy thing, they call for an adjournment until the summer. And so New Hampshire does adjourn until the summer. And of course, it's not a positive sign for the supporters that New Hampshire couldn't ratify it. So we have 8 states having ratified, and then in doubt remaining are New York, where George Clinton is very much against this. The political establishment in New York is very much against this. Virginia, Patrick Henry, George Mason, very much against ratifying the Constitution. Rhode Island's already rejected it. North Carolina also likely to reject it, and of course, New Hampshire. The New York Convention has 46 opponents, 19 supporters elected, Hamilton being one of the supporters. And George Clinton, the governor, is writing to the Virginia opponents, Patrick Henry, George Mason, Edmund Randolph, saying what we should do is come up with similar amendments, have a concerted action to prevent ratification so we can have another convention that will do things differently. Anyway, in June of 1788, the Virginia Convention meets, the New York Convention meets, the New Hampshire Convention reconvenes, and the Virginia Convention, like the Massachusetts Convention, is one of high drama and intrigue, and also great political or philosophical debates. On the opposing side is Patrick Henry, probably the greatest orator of the 18th century. And Henry is, I suppose, what today we would call a demagogue. Henry once argued a case in which not only the jury stood up at the end of Henry's closing argument. They stood up applauding his closing argument, yelled not guilty, and then they picked up Henry on their shoulders and carried him out of the courtroom in triumph. But if you ever want a lawyer, this is the guy to get. And he is very much opposed to this Constitution. The Constitution is sitting on a table in the state capitol in Richmond as they are debating. And Henry points to it, points to that Constitution, warning you about what will happen when that takes effect. This will be the extinguishment of liberty. And such a wonderful orator. He's captivating. And at one point, he talks about how this will shake the foundations of our republic and extinguish liberty. And with that, this is the summer in Richmond, tremendously hot and humid. A thunderstorm breaks out at that moment, and the building does shake. You really have to be a spectacular orator to make that happen. And on the other side, we have James Madison, who sometimes speaks so quietly no one can hear him. And Madison is not a great orator. Madison is known as a great thinker, a little scholarly man. He's about just a little over 5 feet tall and always wears black. And he is arguing against Patrick Henry. Later on, John Marshall, who was also a delegate at the convention, will say that James Madison was the most persuasive man he ever heard. And it really is a masterful work on Madison's part in the Virginia Convention, which really infuriates Patrick Henry and others. Another of the opponents of ratification there is George Mason, another is James Monroe. You have this really high-powered convention in Virginia, and of course the opponents' arguments are no Bill of Rights, the implied powers, Article 1, Section 8, with that necessary and proper clause, which Henry calls the sweeping clause, which will sweep all other powers before it into the maw of Congress. And then the idea of responsibility. By the way, this word is coined during these debates, responsibility, meaning the responsibility of a government to its constituents. And Henry says there is no responsibility in that because you've divided powers, you don't know who did what. Each branch can say it was the other one's fault. Where is the responsibility there? There are, though, some arguments that the opponents use that trip them up. One is the idea of religious freedom. This has been one of the arguments the Presbyterians, the Baptists made about this Constitution. And the opponents say there is no protection of religious minorities here. Well, in Virginia, just 2 years earlier, there had been a big debate. The Virginia Constitution does guarantee freedom of worship, freedom of conscience, but until 1785, you had to pay taxes to support the Episcopal Church in Virginia, until Virginia passed the statute for religious freedom. By the way, does anyone know who got that through the legislature? James Madison, with the support of the Baptists in Virginia. A Baptist minister named John Leland had written to Madison wanting to know what the Constitution said about religious freedom, and he knew Madison is the guy who had gotten their bill through the legislature. The biggest opponent was Patrick Henry. And now Patrick Henry is saying this Constitution doesn't protect religious freedom. And Madison says Virginia had a Constitution which protected religious freedom. Did that protect Baptists from paying taxes to support the Episcopalians? So, another argument that trips them up is the issue of slavery. George Mason, the reason he said he would sooner cut off his right hand than use it to sign the Constitution was the Constitution made a bargain over the slave trade, allowing it to continue for 20 years. Mason had wanted to end it immediately. He called it a crime against humanity. You know, Mason owned about 200 slaves, 200 people, but at the Constitutional Convention and at the Virginia Convention, you would think he was John Brown talking about the horrors of the slave trade. And so we don't like the Constitution because it allows this execrable commerce to continue. But on the other hand, Patrick Henry says the Constitution would give Congress the power to end slavery. Well, wait a minute. Do they not like it because it is pro-slavery, or they don't like it because it's anti-slavery? This kind of a difference that they really can't compromise, they really can't overcome. And the convention in Virginia, another issue that comes up in Virginia is this. Thomas Jefferson had said in one of his letters to Madison, I hope 9 states ratify it, enough to bring it into effect. The others can hold out until amendments are added. Now, Patrick Henry says, well, we hear from a learned friend in France that he doesn't want every state to ratify it. What if another state ratifies it? Is Virginia going to join in and thus prevent amendments from being added? Now, Madison's the guy that Jefferson wrote to, and he says, well, that's not what he meant at all. So here they are in Richmond arguing about what Jefferson meant in a letter he had written to Madison the previous fall. And in Virginia, on the 25th of June, Virginia did vote, and Henry very much against it. Madison and the supporters now saying, we'll adopt it now, add amendments later, and Patrick Henry, of course, it doesn't trust any government to do that later. The vote in Virginia is 89 in favor, 79 opposed. They don't realize this, but New Hampshire had reconvened its convention and had ratified. So 9 states were in when Virginia ratified. In fact, during the debates in Virginia, Madison gets a letter from Hamilton. The letter happens to be over at Houghton Library, and Hamilton says it's pretty likely that, he says, New York is going to reject it. Madison says things don't look good in Virginia either. And Hamilton says, well, if Virginia rejects it, New York is certain to. So they really are despairing about what is going to happen to this system they created, neither one knowing that New Hampshire already had ratified it. So the system would take effect with or without Virginia and New York. When the New York Convention, really dominated by Governor Clinton and his allies Melancton Smith, hears that 9 states have ratified, they ratify it too. They want to be part of the system. So this is, in 1787 and 88, an extraordinarily contentious debate about fundamental issues which in some cases still affect us and in other cases do not. The outcome always was in doubt, and even as the government was created, it's in doubt. What kind of amendments will be added? And in fact, when the Congress met in 1789 and James Madison wanted to turn the attention of Congress to adopting amendments, Elbridge Gerry opposed that move. Gerry had been opposed to ratification in the first place. But we have this system created with this promise of amendments to be added. And that promise is really the debt we owe to the opponents of the Constitution who saw some of its flaws and indicated a way to correct them. So this is perhaps the most important political debate in the history of the country, in which great issues were debated, discussed, argued about, even fought over by people on different sides. And once it was resolved, the New York example, where the opponents now join in to become part of the system so that they will not be left out. So that's the conclusion. That's how it happened. North Carolina, by the way, their convention rejected it. And once the amendments were added, North Carolina did join the Union, as you're probably aware. And so too did Rhode Island. And so too then did 37 other states. So thank you.
Happy to take questions.
Yes, I am
We're
yes,
going to
I-
ask people to speak into the mic.
Okay, great.
Ed, do you have a mic? You'll take that side of the room. I'll
I
take
think
this
John
side.
had his hand up first.
Yep.
And
Right here.
then this lady over here.
Do you have any of your courses online and therefore available to us?
That's a good question. Yes and no. I teach courses online through the Harvard Extension School, where anyone can sign up and take. I also have just done a course on Benjamin Franklin for the teaching company, which you can, it'll be about in the next couple of weeks. Course on colonial America. I mean, now I sound like an ad. I did a course on the Constitution that's available on Udemy. I don't know if they're still running it. I lose interest once I've done something, but maybe I'll just stay here for the rest and just keep talking. But yeah, there are some are available online, and I can give you my card, and then I'll start hounding you to check them out. But thank you for asking, John. Yes, a substantive question over here. My books are also available for purchase at Amazon and other places. I know that question was coming. Yes, Kathy.
I can just talk loud. I'm a tour guide on the Freedom Trail, and we start in Boston Common
Yeah.
talking about hangings of witches and Quakers in Boston Common by the Puritans. I'm wondering if you can say that the protections in the 10 items in the Bill of Rights, a lot of which had to do with civil liberties, protections for fair trials, were informed by the Puritan experience of, like that witches really could have used the right to counsel, for instance, and that the kind of overreach of the Puritans was part of what made the Bill of Rights seem like it was necessary.
I suppose. I don't want to give the Puritans too bad a rap. David Hume wrote a wonderful history of England, and Hume, great skeptic, he does chastise the Puritans for things, but he also points out the Puritans are responsible for the idea of liberty, and this is something that comes from the Puritans. He's kind of, well, I don't want to get off on this, but yeah, the Puritans, and ironically enough, I think it was yesterday was the anniversary of the body of liberties, the body of laws that the Puritans adopted in 1641. Body of liberties, which also is the first North American colony to legalize slavery. So you have, the Puritans do have different sides to them. We could spend the rest of the day talking about the lighter side of the Puritans, I suppose. Yeah, that would be a fun lecture. But yeah, you're right. They saw these things, but I think the real thing was British practice, which is why the Constitution defines treason. It's the only crime defined in the Constitution. And what you can only be convicted on either open confession in open court, or the testimony of two witnesses to the same overt act. That is, they understood the power of the state. The other protections, you see, and actually you see the Pennsylvania proposals go further than the Massachusetts ones do in these civil protections. And later it is Madison who takes all of these different proposals sent in by the states, as well as the state bills of rights and declarations of rights, and then codifies them into these 10 amendments. So that's a very good point. But yeah, they were aware of this. But the other thing to remember about the federal Constitution is the protections in court really are protections in state court. And that's a subject very much in debate. What will be the limits of the federal judiciary? Will the state judiciary have primacy here? And in fact, it's not until the 20th century, and it's through the 14th Amendment, that the protections of the first 10 amendments are extended to people in state courts. It's an interesting question. It'd be one, I'm happy to meet you on Boston Common someday, and we can talk about it, the site of the old hanging tree.
More questions? Okay, I think, is this working?
It sounds
We'll
like
put in
it.
a fresh battery. Here you go.
Do you think that the Constitution is a document for all time, or do we need to worry about changes in the future?
That's an excellent question. Do I think the Constitution is a document for all time? No. Do I want the particular people who are involved in running things today to change it? No. This is, you do think about it. They're not anticipating every possible problem, but they are very much informed, as Kathy's question suggested, with what had come before. So they really are trying to solve a certain set of problems with this document, but they're also very much informed by other systems and what has happened to them. I don't want to start talking about what's informing the political leaders today, but it seems to be less of what's happened before and more how can we use this for an advantage to our side, which people like Madison were aware of. They were aware of what Madison called the vicious arts of politics. But yeah, no, it's not something meant to last. In fact, at the convention itself, when someone says, remember, we're not just creating a system for now, but for the next 150 years, And Nathaniel Gorham, who was a delegate from Massachusetts, said, can we really imagine that this whole country, including the West, and by that he meant everything up to the Mississippi River, is going to remain under one government in 150 years? In the 1830s, James Fenimore Cooper was writing about the American population growing and what it would be by the 1930s, and he said the first thought that comes to mind is the impossibility of 100 million people continuing to live under one government. Of course, the supporters of ratification point out how much stronger the United States is if the states are together than if they become separate confederacies, 13 or 3 or 4. And that's certainly true. It's certainly something Lincoln realized at the time of the Civil War. Yeah, you could let the southern states leave, but that's going to trigger more secession, and then the United States would be pretty much like Europe or like other places, South America. I mean, these other examples are very much in their minds. And part of the strength of the country is the fact that it does control a continent. And changing the system, I really shudder to think what would come out of a convention today. So.
Question to kind of verify history here. In the late 1700s, there was still a large number of supporters of the British government. A lot went to Canada, a lot stayed in the States. Did that influence the Constitution in the development of it in any way?
That's a good question. I suspect Americans, I mean those on this side of the border, I think until into the 19th century continued to imagine Canada becoming part of this enterprise. In fact, it's only after 1815 that somewhat they give up that idea. So I don't think so, and I think it's a very interesting question. There are some, Wilson, for example, had come relatively late to supporting independence. In fact, his house had been mobbed during the Revolution, and he's shortly after the British leave Philadelphia. So there are people like Wilson then who would be suspected of being pro-British. And one thing the system really does is it is not emulating the British system. It's really more resting on the systems that are developed in the States. So it's a very interesting question. I would want to give it more thought. Do you know anything more about it? Or are you just asking a good question? Okay.
It's the book War of 1812 really delves into that whole issue. And,
yeah, that is, that we'll get Canada, which is something they thought in 1776 too. They send Franklin and John Carroll up to convince the Canadians to come over, and the Canadians continue to reject our treaties. In fact, the bicentennial of the War of 1812 was a bigger deal in Canada than it was here. And there, believe it or not, is anyone Canadian? Because they treated this as their war of independence from us. Imagine that. Imagine that. The ingrates.
Hang on. There's a question here in the back.
Yes. Is mic okay?
That's,
Okay. States like California, and I think there may be Texas also, have spoken of dividing their state, north and south in California, and east and west in Texas, and so on. Is that strictly a state adventure,
yes.
Or do they have to go through
No.
the federal government?
No, a state can divide if, this comes up relatively early. Tennessee and Kentucky both break off, Kentucky breaks off from Virginia, and there you have Virginia legislature approves this, then the state legislature and a group in Kentucky approves it. So if it's within a state, they could do that. I don't think it would be wise to do that, but they could. Maine splits off from Massachusetts in 1820. During the Civil War, of course, West Virginia secedes from Virginia, but there again, Virginia no longer recognized the United States. So what happened in this case was there were the legislators from the western part of Virginia meeting in Wheeling as the legislature of Virginia, and then they approved West Virginia's secession from Virginia, and then they met as the West Virginia legislature, and they approved becoming their own state, and I guess they've lived happily ever after. But yeah, no, Congress doesn't, if it's within a state, no, Congress doesn't. Yes, sir.
It seems that in all the debates that you've talked about, there were enough losers willing to accept their losses, to accept what they didn't prefer.
Yeah.
For things to keep going. Do you know where that feeling came from historically, the willingness to concede?
I think that's a good question. Yes, do you have a follow-up?
You haven't mentioned George Washington's personality has to have come through and affected his plan.
Yeah, his personality does come through. Okay, he's very much in support of this, but so are other people. Benjamin Franklin, for example. Okay, and so it's not necessarily faith in these guys will do no wrong, but it's other people who are supporting this, and that we will be part of whatever solution is. So for George Clinton, does it make sense to keep pushing for amendments or another convention, or Clinton actually is a candidate for president in 1788? And then he ultimately, this is one of the great ironies, two of the leading opponents of ratification are George Clinton and Elbridge Gerry. Both of them serve as vice presidents under James Madison. So I think part of it is recognizing that we need to see some change in the system. And it's not that this is a perfect system being created, but we'll take at their word that this is a government of limited powers, and we will keep an eye on them. And so part of it is that 9 states have ratified, the thing is going to take effect. So rather than block it, we'll become part of it. What happens with North Carolina and Rhode Island is the other states essentially blockade them. And that's going to bring them around. But the amendments, Madison sees these amendments as crucial to the good faith of what's just been argued. And if they had said, no, now we're in, forget the amendments, that would have been disastrous. I think anyone other than Washington would have been disastrous. And then, of course, being able to fight this out through the political process is a very important thing. But yeah, that spirit, I suppose, also comes from having fought this war. And as Linda said in the beginning, this was an extraordinarily difficult thing to pull off. But as we've seen from recent revolutions, too, often ousting the bad regime is often the easier thing than creating a stable regime. And so, very good question.
We have time for a couple more questions. Anybody?
No one dares, okay.
Okay.
Well, thank
If
you all.
not,